Hi, my name is Kelly Demons. I'm a Penobscot from the Penobscot Nation on Indian Island in Old Town, Maine. I'm singing the traditional Penobscot song, the Welcome Song. Aliyaha, 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 Aliyaha,
Thank you, Kelly Demons, for that beautiful welcome song. This is Peter Forbes, one of the co-founders of First Light, and I am with Ann Pollard Ranco, a friend and a colleague who's going to introduce herself in a moment. We're talking together today about islands and narratives. Ann, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for making space in your life for this conversation. I've been looking forward to it a lot. How would you like to introduce yourself? How do you want our viewers to know you, Ann?
Hi, Peter. Hi, everybody. I'm so happy to be here today. I'll take a moment to introduce myself. I like to introduce myself in Penobscot first to honor this ancestral homeland and the language that has been spoken by my ancestors for thousands of years. I'm an apprentice of the Penobscot language with Carol Dana, who's one of our language keepers from the Penobscot Nation. So I'll do my best. I'm still learning, but I definitely want to honor this space and do my best. So Kwe, Naraliwizi, and Pollard Ranco, Naga Nojiawi, Panawebskik. Hello, my name is Ann Pollard Ranco, and I'm from the place where the rocks widen. I'm a citizen of the Penobscot Nation, and since a very early age, I've been involved in activism. Later on, I became an artist, writer, and use those mediums to help to bring visibility to Wabanaki people and as a vehicle to talk about a lot of issues that our people face and have faced for hundreds of years. I also serve on the board of Bomazine Land Trust. We're an organization led by Wabanaki people to honor Indigenous spaces, our homeland, and to work in rematriation land back efforts. I also have been working with my mom's habitat consulting company called Know Your Land Consulting. And recently we've been working on a restorative ecology project with Blue Hill Heritage Trust. And this serves to deepen connections to the Blue Hill Peninsula and this vital and important place of my ancestors.
Thank you, Ann. We're
Certainly.
We're grateful for you as a human being, and we're grateful to elevate your voice within the First Light community. You and I have been having a conversation since the winter, really, since January, about islands and narrative. And it all began, this conversation really began with a vision that you told me one day, I think it was in late February or March, about a vision you had for yourself reconnecting to the islands this spring and summer. Would you mind sharing as much of that vision as you're comfortable with our viewers?
Absolutely, I'd love to share this. And I would really love to share some images to go along with the story. So going back several decades ago, back when I was a child, my parents wanted to instill this connection and knowledge that my people came from the coastal territories. I traced my ancestry back to these places. So this is an image of me, Annie, as I was known and still am known to a lot of people, little Annie, on a beach in Cape Erasure called Red Man's Beach. In the background is Pond Island, and I'll tell a little bit about Pond Island as we continue our conversation, but just keep that in mind. So in this image here, it is a mid-January or February day. That's actually snow that you see on the beach there. And I have this very distinct memory of my parents on any winter day that the sun started to feel warm. So the February weather, when the sun just starts to be a little bit brighter in the sky, I would be packed up in the car and we'd drive to the coast, and Red Man's Beach was one of our favorite places to go. And until it was sectioned off into private lots where houses were built in, I think it's the early 2000s, ongoing. There's still a lot of construction going on there, but we lost access to this really important spot. And this was sort of one of the first instances as a child of realizing that these spaces were not guaranteed. Access to these places was something that was a chance, the happen chance. It wasn't something that was, you know, part of a stronger movement of being able to return to these places. It was temporary. So that feeling, if we want to go to the next slide, or an image, it just shows this love that we had for this beach. My dad is, I think, opening a can of beans here, and I might be sipping on some hot chocolate and toasting a cinnamon roll that my mom had freshly made that morning. So when we weren't able to go to Red Man's Beach anymore, that sort of feeling of loss is an experience as a child that I realized very early on. And it's sort of been this constant reminder that never to take these places for granted because we might not be able to go there again. So sort of fast forwarding to late last fall, I had this strong calling, and calling is sort of the only way I can describe it, to explore my ancestral connections to Mount Desert Island and Acadia National Park, as it's now known, where millions of people visit during the tourist season. So the most quote unquote desirable months of being there. And something that I realized in thinking about this place is that my ancestors cherished these spaces and had such a deep connection with these places. The sort of feeling of this dissonance between the tourism, which is very heavily just going to a place, experiencing a very, very thin layer of the history of these places on more of a consumptive level, as opposed to the deep connection that my ancestors would have had with these places. So I wanted to take this winter as an opportunity to reconnect and honor these spaces. So one thing that I did, Wabanaki, people of the dawn, is I got up on some of the coldest mornings during the winter time and went out and watched the sunrise. And I think in this photograph that we're looking at right now, we can see some sea smoke rising. And if any of you are familiar with sea smoke, it's different from sea fog in that it only occurs under very, very frigid conditions. So I believe this morning clocked minus 14 degrees Fahrenheit, on the thermometer, and there might have been a bit of a wind chill as well. But this is looking over at Otter Cliffs at Acadia National Park off of the Park Loop Road. And it's one of my most cherished memories of this past winter, just sitting there watching the sea smoke rise. And we were actually, my friend and I were actually visited by an otter swimming off the shore who popped its head up out of the water and looked at us. And I think sort of was scrutinizing us and thinking, what are you doing out here? It's too cold to be on the beach right now. But yeah, this is just a really, really special moment. I felt such a connection to this place, watching the sunrise there as my ancestors would have. If we want to move on to the next image, this is a space on Schoodic Peninsula, a part of Acadia National Park that doesn't get as frequently visited as the Mount Desert Island portion of the park. This is a really, really beautiful spot called Raven's Nest. It's a little bit off the beaten path and isn't visited as much. It used to be far more of a destination until Acadia National Park took it off its sort of places to visit list. I think that there are some concerns about erosion and the safety of the cliffs themselves. So with a really respectful mindset and making sure to pay attention to any places that they'd marked off as, restoring the habitat, I took this photograph and sat there for hours watching the sunset. Actually, this is the sunset photograph. So from the sunrise to the sunset, that was sort of my connection, the light and the way that Penobscot people in our language sees light. It's a very beautiful relationship with the light. And that was something that I really wanted to convey in my photography. So you'll often see in my work, it will either be a sunrise to honor the people of the dawn or the sunset to honor the light and the beauty that comes with that. So if we want to move to the next image.
Thank you for sharing these, Anne. They're just
Oh,
spectacular.
absolutely. And then this is an early morning hike with a dear friend whose inn I stayed at while I was reconnecting with Acadia National Park. And this is on what is now known as the Beehive. I wish I knew the Penobscot or Wabanaki, maybe Passamaquoddy word for this place, but I don't think that we have a name that is has survived. And I really wish I knew the name. And that was just sort of, those are a few images of my time at Acadia National Park. And hopefully through these images, that love and connection that I feel so much in my heart is conveyed a little bit.
Oh, it is, Anne. And I loved seeing the picture of young Annie and your father. Would you mind going a little bit further and just telling us a few more stories, if you're willing, about what the islands have meant to, and the coast itself, to you and your family?
Certainly, absolutely. So going back to being a very young child, I think that I began visiting the coast before I was born, and in the womb, I think like that was my first experience visiting these places. My mom has told me about a story when we visited Picture Rocks in Machias Bay, the petroglyph site, when I was being carried in the womb, and my earliest memories are of seeing the petroglyphs on the rocks and feeling this deep connection to that place. I grew up picking sweetgrass in the marshes all over the coast. So if any of you are familiar with sweetgrass, you'll also know that it has a beautiful aroma, but it is also a very culturally significant material that's used not only in basket work, but also for ceremonial purposes. So the smell of the ocean air, the smell of sweetgrass, the smell of fresh picked cranberries off of the marsh in the fall months are sort of so deeply ingrained in becoming who I am. It's inseparable, as I think that my ancestors would have felt about these places as well. So I'm so grateful that my parents instilled this in me at a very young age and wanted me to be proud that my ancestors came from these places, because I think they knew that Indigenous people in Maine face so much negativity and racism, that these places bring such beauty and healing, that if I was brought up in these spaces, I would be able to always have those places to fill me up in my heart, as well as, share my love. And I'm extraordinarily grateful for those
Mhm.
experiences. This image is from Deer Isle in a town
Mhm.
called Sunshine. And one morning, I think this might have been in early February or late January morning. This was one of my first experiences in reconnecting with the Deer Isle, Stonington region. I had stayed at a friend's Airbnb and woke up at 4:30 and pulled out the gazetteer. And I didn't know where I was going for the sunrise that morning. And I just said a little prayer to my ancestors to guide me to a beautiful place to watch the sunrise. So I sort of just picked a point on the gazetteer and drove there in the pitch black, never seen it before. And I just remember I have this very distinct memory of sitting on a rock looking out at the dawn, so the pre-dawn, just the light creeping on up above the mountains, and just feeling like the sense of awe and wonder at how beautiful it was and calm it was. And even though it was a frigid morning, it just felt so peaceful and welcoming. And it wasn't until later I learned that in the, I want to say, past 150 to 200 years, that was one of the last places that my ancestors had a really direct access and connection to, looking off at an island called White Island, off of Sunshine. And I didn't learn that until afterwards, but I really feel like my ancestors brought me to this place as sort of an introduction and welcome back to the islands. So this sort of brings me to the conversation that I had with you, Peter, about
Mhm.
why the islands, why this calling. So after I had connected with Acadia National Park, Mount Desert Island, for the duration of the winter, I said a prayer to my ancestors to ask for guidance. Where to go from here? How can I help share this love that we've had for thousands of years for these places? And at that very instant, there was a message that was go to the islands of Penobscot Bay, Stonington, Deer Isle, but it was an image. It was an image of the map and where these islands were. And it struck me like, so it was just like this aha moment. And at that moment, I realized that all of my energy needed to be devoted towards accessing the islands and being there and reconnecting with these places that my family had such memory of, yet hadn't been able to access. And that's sort of where these conversations began.
Yeah, thank you so much. And it's so important for all of our viewers to understand that whole story and the very powerful parenting that your mom and dad did to instill in you that love, all the way up to what you just said, your desire to pursue a love that you've had for thousands of years. Would you mind just sharing the obstacles to a young Wabanaki person to pursue the love that you've had for thousands of years? And we'll get to the question about what happened that day, but can you give just a general overview about some of the obstacles, how easy, how hard it is for you to pursue that vision of getting out to those islands, seeing them?
Absolutely. I think coming from the Penobscot Nation and hearing stories about my father, my aunts, and my uncles and grandparents, when they left the reservation, they were faced with such racism and hatred. And for those of you familiar with the Penobscot Nation and the Indian Island Reservation, you'll know it's a very small island in the middle of the Penobscot River with very little land for healing, for growing food, for coming together. It's such a small space. But when my forebears tried to leave the island, they were met with violence, hatred being spewed at them, and told to get back on the reservation. And if you just go a little bit further back in time to the bounties in the 1700s and ongoing violence against Indigenous people up until ongoing to present day violence against Indigenous women. It's just something that makes access very difficult because we have so much trauma in our history that has become generational trauma. And when you think about access and trying to be able to visit these places, that's something that you always have to acknowledge, that my ancestors faced such hardship to protect these places, to take care of these places, and for hundreds of years have been fighting for access to these places. But we were faced with such ongoing colonization and trauma resulting and stemming from that we ended up confined to a very small reservation with very little means for leaving. And it wasn't really until my generation that our voices have been heard in platforms or on platforms such as, you know, this interview that we're having right now, or being able to have a nonprofit organization dedicated to honoring these spaces through Wabanaki leadership. So these are all very new things. These are recent things. And I think that going back to my ancestors and my family, it's so important to acknowledge the lingering effects and ongoing effects of the lack of access.
And and your voice matters tremendously to all of us at First Light, and I'm sorry to ask you to unpack and relive. Your voice will make a difference into how the islands are managed and we behave as society, and that's why we're doing this interview. So thank you for the challenges of having to educate and explain. And I'm afraid I'm gonna need to ask you a little bit more about that, and I hope we can do that in a way that's really comfortable for you. I want you and I decided to do this interview because there was one particular experience that happened. It wasn't just about that vision of your desire to reconnect, even though that's super powerful. There was a particular incident that happened. Do you mind just telling us about what happened that day and just the particulars of it, and we'll follow up. I promise I'll follow up with the meaning of it.
Certainly. So this spring, as I described to you, this calling brought me to the islands. And on one particular day, I decided to visit Bard Island Preserve. So I arrived there and it was a beautiful early spring day. And I was so happy to be there and walked the amazingly gorgeous mossy trail with roots intertwined on the path to where the beach opened up and tidal bar access to Bard Islands was there as I was there at around the low tide mark. So I had a really wonderful time being the only person there, singing some songs and just sort of honoring this space and acknowledging my ancestors and just feeling this sense of connection and gratitude to be there and experiencing that. And when I returned, I read the sign at the welcome kiosk, and my heart sunk in my chest. The words on the sign said, "As you walk the paths of Bard Island Preserve, you join the Wabanaki people who summered here several thousand years ago, and the Stinson family who farmed on this point a mere 100 or so years ago." And the words, "You join the Wabanaki people who summered here several thousand years ago hit me like a ton of bricks.
Mhm.
Not only was it historically inaccurate, but completely romanticized the truth,
Mhm.
the true history of what happened to my ancestors on these islands. And that experience brought me to contacting Peter, my dear friend Peter, and hoping that this experience of that felt at the time like such a setback, how can we reframe this experience? And instead of allowing it to be a setback and reconnection and access, take this experience and allow it the platform for changing narrative and telling the truth. And that
And
was
that's our
something,
work.
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I thought that through our conversation today, hopefully we can spark some further conversations amongst our constituency.
Well, thank you so much. And it's a gift, to be invited into someone's hurt and pain and be given the chance to make amends. And that's what I feel like you're doing. So I want to unpack things a little bit. Like, who do you think, Anne, who do you think that sign was written for? Let's start with that.
Certainly. So it was very evident that this sign was not written for Wabanaki people, for BIPOC. It felt very much like it was tailored to a very specific audience, that being the non-Indigenous, non-BIPOC community. And that was one thing that struck me so much from the get-go, that outdoor access across diverse communities is something that has been discouraged in the past. And there are so many barriers to access across broad spectrums of people, where this sign spoke and welcomed a very, very small percentage of people that didn't tell the true story and welcoming others as well.
Yeah, and I know you to be a kind and generous person, and I'm sure our viewers already get a big hit of that. What do you imagine the sign was trying, or the writers of the sign were trying to accomplish? What do you think their best intentions were? We know what the impacts were, but what do you think they were trying to accomplish?
I think it's a really interesting question, because when we look at Indigenous presence along the coast and on the islands, we can look at it from an archaeological standpoint, that yes, for thousands of years, my ancestors have been living in relationship with these places up until very recent times of colonization, not in the wholly inaccurate thousands of years ago perspective that they were being framed in this context. So I've really toiled with this question. What were they trying? What were their intentions in writing this sign? And I don't think that anybody wants to outwardly tell a lie, but I think sometimes lies make us feel better about history and the sad history and the disenfranchisement that my people have experienced. It's sort of a way to justify ownership of land by placing Indigenous people in a very bygone era as if we don't exist, which is something that, I think that, in the circle, we understand that Wabanaki people were not removed from the state of Maine as our brothers and sisters of the Eastern Seaboard and Cherokee Nation were removed, because the colonists thought that Wabanaki people would simply die out or assimilate. And in fact, my tribe, the Penobscot Nation, I think it was in the mid 1800s, we only had around 240 living members of our tribe. And that's pretty profound, coming from tens of thousands of people and tribes that have experienced massacres like my ancestors at Norridge Walk. I'm a direct descendant of the 1724 massacre there, where one of my ancestors, half-armed Nicolar, survived the massacre and fled to the Penobscot Nation almost 80 miles away with a severed arm. And that's where he got the same half-armed Nicolar. So that just gives a little bit of context for the trauma, but also how recent it is. You know, these are all stories, these are all living memories of the people who survived and our ancestors and people who didn't make it and who didn't have an opportunity to be visiting these places as they rightly should have, because they were killed.
And so to say on a sign that you walk with Wabanaki ancestors, for a non-Wabanaki person to say that is, how do you characterize that? Insulting?
Yeah, it's extraordinarily offensive. Yeah, it's an absolute denial of the true history and patronization and romanticization of the history that across many channels, Indigenous people are faced with this sense of the noble Indian and or savage, as you know, we're so familiar with being called. And to say you're walking with the Wabanaki, you're joining the Wabanaki people, it is extraordinarily offensive.
Well, and also if we compare the difficulty you have as a Wabanaki person to go there yourself, that adds another layer of complexity and hurt to the story, that a white person who might be able to more easily get there, feel culturally accepted there, they can walk with these supposed Wabanaki ancestors, but you have so many more challenges at that.
Yeah, that's very well said. Absolutely. I think that the trauma that we carry when we're walking with our ancestors, it means something very different. It means that we're saddened. We know the history of what happened there. So to walk with our ancestors is something that it's poignant, knowing that blood was shed there, that the land was taken, and we were forced to live on the reservation when for hundreds of years since, this island and Bard Island have been enjoyed at the expense of Wabanaki lives by non-Indigenous people. So it's a very different framework.
Yeah, thank you again, Ann, for unpacking all of that for me and all of our viewers. You've answered this in some different ways, but even being kind and generous, and let's assume that the motivations were to honor. Let's just assume that, and to make connections. Did reading that sign affirm or deny your presence there that day?
Absolutely. It felt like I was a ghost. It felt like I was reading about a people that no longer existed. It felt like I was reading about a people whose memory only lived in a context of thousands of years ago as having had relationship with that place. It completely denied my presence there, denied every single Wabanaki person's presence who visited the island or Deer Isle.
When we first talked about this, the term or phrase erasure narrative came up. I don't remember if you said it, I said it, but could you just tell our listeners from your perspective, what is an erasure narrative? And how does it apply to this particular situation, or broadly to
Mhm.
Wabanaki access to islands in Maine in general.
Yeah, absolutely. I can speak a little bit from personal experience about what erasure narrative means to me. I think
Mhm.
that it might mean something different in other contexts, but in relation to my experience, I've grown up as a person of color in a very white dominated space. And from an early age, going back to those memories of visiting those islands, Indigenous presence in Maine has always felt like an invisibility cloak. You are in your homeland, yet most people don't know you exist.
Mm.
And this is such a powerful feeling of it's mind-boggling. It really is to exist in your space that your ancestors have been in for over 15,000 years. Yet most people, if you went up and asked them, and I can say this because when I talk about Wabanaki people in Maine, I'm often met with this. I didn't know there were Indians
Mm.
in Maine.
Mm.
And that is this common narrative that I've experienced since childhood of this sort of, I don't know if it's a denial or just lack of education. And I think that really speaks to our education system here in the state up until recently, where Wabanaki history wasn't taught in schools. So when people aren't educated and we are such an invisible people, it just produces this ignorance. And hopefully that speaks a little bit to that.
It does. It does. Thank you. Thank you so much. What you said about growing up as a Wabanaki person, a person of color in a state that is so white, and knowing of your your ancestry here and your heritage. I think of that sign that you saw as something of a flag. Does that make
Mm.
any sense to you? How is a sign like a flag?
Mm, absolutely. I think a sign is really like a flag because it's an authority. A
Mm.
sign is a voice of authority on a place, a topic. And in this case, the sign at Bard Island was like staking a flag on the land and claiming ownership of the space, control of the story that's being told,
Mm.
and creating a paradigm that isn't reality, but is believed because it's an authority. The sign, is written by an institution that is a credible institution and has ties to a national organization. So this must be facts. Wabanaki people mustn't have been here in recent times. They died out thousands of years ago. They didn't summer here just a few hundred years ago. There isn't a Wabanaki person standing here right now who's summering and on the island and living, I've recently moved to Brooksville, and so, living on the coast, it completely devalues this continuation. But a flag and a sign as
Mm.
this figure of authority speaks volumes.
Well, you speak volumes. Thank you so much for speaking so courageously to this topic. I want to talk with you about repair, and
Mm-hmm.
and I want to say to our viewers that we're having this conversation uh, in a way that allows Anne to speak her mind fully around questions that feel hopefully like they get to the heart of the matter and allow her voice to be heard. Um, that's really, really important in our view. And it's also what the nonprofit organizations that are connected to Bard Island agreed to. So I want to thank them for that, for not being defensive, not being, quick to want to immediately create a solution, but to really allow us and encourage us to have this conversation on your terms and then to have it widely shared. But that's not the full repair, right? I mean, the full repair is much, much bigger, and it goes beyond that sign and that place. And it's a lot to ask one individual what they feel the full repair should be, but I know you to be a strong individual, so I want to ask you, what is the real repair that's needed here, and how can we begin that?
I think that we could speak to a repair in a couple of different contexts, one of which would be pertaining to this issue, as well as a more broader focus on the island. So maybe I'll start with that. So the vision that I see for the future, and many Wabanaki people see for the future, is land back for some of these spaces to be returned to the original caretakers. Because when we are able to take care of these spaces in our traditional ways, it gives us the autonomy and empowers us in the healing process that both we as a people and in relationship with the land need, and that has been denied to us. And so that's a broader in the future hope that I have. But on a more, at the level when we're talking about how to make amends for the sign, I think that Indigenous voices need to be amplified and honored in these spaces. I think that Indigenous people need to be made to feel welcome. And when we go and put our hearts out to meet with people and to discuss our trauma, then to be met with a sign like that can feel like a setback. But like I mentioned earlier, I think that it provides an opportunity to amplify Indigenous voices, artists, writers, in welcoming our people back to these spaces and to continue our relationship with these islands. If you look at the shell middens that are found on so many of the islands and coastlines, these are tangible links to our ancestors who cracked open that shell hundreds of years ago, up until 5,000 years ago in some cases. So when you're looking at how to welcome people back and to honor people, I think that first of all is the education piece, is being able to educate people in far more than a sign. I think that this is a broader opportunity for education through programming led by Wabanaki people, so we can tell our stories, the truth from our perspective, things that we haven't been able to say or haven't been given a platform to share for hundreds of years for fear of aggression, which is something that if we spoke our language, we were punished. Up until very recently, children were stolen, and it became something where our voices were silenced. And I think that Indigenous voices in this healing process need to be honored and welcomed. I think this is a beautiful opportunity.
Thank you so much for that, Ann. Your voice is strong, and it is welcomed, and may our First Light community rise to the call to action that you're kindly giving to us in this moment. And I'm
grateful for my ancestors who have inspired me and guided me. I'm just a conduit for it. It's something that's greater than just me.
I imagine all of us feel that right now. So thank you so much. The work continues. Those that are watching this know that. You know that there is a First Light working group that is now focusing on island access, and others have generously offered to assist that. We are fully committed in this partnership to elevate Wabanaki voices, to provide access, and to make amends. And thank you so much, Ann Pollard Ranco, for sharing your wisdom and your life experiences with all of us.
Thank you so much.